We are so pleased to have with us as our guest on Awake to Truth, Lauren Burns. She is a wife, a mom, a physical therapist, a Christian, and she has an amazing story to share from her childhood. And I don't want to take away any of the details. And so, Lauren, I'm going to say, just tell your story.
Well, it's an honor to be able to share my story. And I hope as I share my story, you hear what God has done in my life. You don't hear Lauren Burns, but you hear Jesus throughout the whole thing. Um, when I was 7 years old, my father, who is from Jordan, he kidnapped me and he took me to Jordan. But I want to tell you a little bit of the backstory there. My mother's from Florida and my father is from Jordan, and they both met in Richardson, Texas. My mom moved from Florida to start a new life and go to school and just wanted something different. And she was working at a restaurant. And my father moved from Jordan to also go to school. And he was working at the same restaurant. So he was a chef and my mom was a waitress, and they fell in love. And they got married. They didn't date very long. I want to say maybe 6 months or so. And about 4 years into their marriage, my mom became pregnant. And during that time, things were not always easy in their marriage. They had some difficulties. But after she became pregnant, my dad was excited to be a father. And he soon into her pregnancy, he told my mom that his dad was sick and he had to go to Jordan, and he left. And at the age of, I want to say around 25, my mom was by herself in Richardson, Texas, pregnant, alone, didn't know when her husband was going to come back. And she had really good friends at the time, Beverly and Rick Lambert. If any of you are country fans, Miranda Lambert, she's an amazing country singer. Rick and Bev are her parents, and they happen to be my mom's very, very, very good friends. And Rick and Bev were private investigators at that time. Rick was a police officer in Dallas, and they just had a special bond with my mom. And so when my dad had left, my mom was panicking, and Beverly said, "Don't worry, Kathy, we're going to get through this. I don't know what he's doing, but you're not alone. We are just like your family. We are going to be right beside you." So she went into labor early and with all the stress, and my dad came back right before she was about to have me. And of course, she was distraught and angry and emotional. And he just came back and said, "Well, I went to Jordan to make a home for us. I found a job. I found a home." And my mom was like, "What do you mean you went to Jordan to make a home for us? I never agreed to going to Jordan. I never wanted to move." But he just had this big, sense, I guess, that now that he was a father, he wanted to raise me with his religious beliefs. And that was the way it was going to go. And he wanted me to have an Arabic name. And so there they are in the hospital, and my mom's arguing. It's like, "No, she's going to have an American name. We're not doing any of this." So by the time I was 6 weeks old, my mom had already filed for divorce and had full custody of me, trying to figure out how to live on our own without any child support. And God just provided in every step of the way. As I look back, as I'm in the middle of writing my story and into a book, these people came alongside my mom, Bev and Rick. They were like my family that were just friends. And then a woman by the name of Joyce, my mom was introduced to, said, "Kathy, move in with me. I don't have children. I'm by myself. I will help you with Lauren. Let me help you financially." And she did. And so my mom was able to work at the apartments where we lived. And Joyce was like another mother to me, taking care of me when my mom couldn't. And it's just like this village that God provided. So until I was 7 years old, I was, the normal divorced kid going back and forth between my mom's house and my dad's house. And my dad had remarried, and he had, I love my stepmother. She's also from the Middle East, but really raised in the United States. And then they had two other children. So they had another daughter and a son. And so I love going to spend time at my dad's house. I got to see my siblings, and it was different because they had more of a family. With my mom, it was just the two of us. We were just like best friends. At my dad's house, it was a house full of kids, and then my dad was working at a restaurant. And he was like the Disney dad, taking me to see the movies and take me to Penny Whistle Park and all the fun things. Until I was 7. And I had just started a new school, and my dad said, Kathy, can I keep Lauren for one extra night for Halloween? It was Halloween weekend, and I want to take her trick-or-treating. And my mom said, sure. They had a great relationship. She's like, sure, you can take her for an extra day. Just make sure she goes to school on Monday because it's a new school. She needs to be at school. He's like, yeah, no problem, no problem. So again, God he just, every step of the way, he shows up. And so that Monday, my mom decided to go have lunch with me. Well, she's a single mom. She can't get away from work to go have lunch with me, but it was just one of those things. Shows up and she's looking through the line as my class is lining up, and I'm not there. And the teacher catches my mom's face and sees that she's concerned, and she goes over and she's like, Kathy, Lauren never came to school today. And my mom's like, what do you mean Lauren didn't come to school? And she was like, I don't know what happened, but she never came. So back then there were no cell phones. And so she went over to the payphone, and the first call she made was to my dad's restaurant. And when they answered, they said, Ollie didn't come to work today. So then her little red flag started going off. And so then she called his house, and there was no answer. And it's like the Holy Spirit just spoke to her right then. And she decided to call the headquarters of the Alia Airport in New York. So from that payphone, before she even got home, she called. And the lady answered, and she said, I need your help. Do you have an Ali Bayan and a Lauren Bayan on your flight to Jordan? And the lady said, ma'am, I can't give out that kind of information. And then my mom just took a breath and said, please, I think my ex-husband has taken my daughter. Will you please help me? So then the lady said, ma'am, one moment, give me 1 second. And a few seconds passed, and she came back and she said, yes, ma'am. I have a Lauren Bayan and an Ali Bayan landing in Amman, Jordan this evening. And that was the moment she knew that my dad had taken me. Her next phone call was to Rick Lambert's pager, and it was a 911 with her phone number. So Rick and Beverly happened to be working at the courthouse in Dallas that day together. And so he immediately called my mom's phone number back, and Beverly was sitting there listening to Rick, and my mom began to tell Rick, Ollie's taken Lauren. I don't know what to do. I just found out that she's gone. And so as soon as Rick hung up the phone, Beverly said, Ollie took Lauren, didn't she? So they immediately left everything, went straight to my mom's townhouse in Richardson. And that's when they began the days of searching, trying to figure out what to do. How do they get me back? With Rick's police work and private investigation experience, the first thing he told my mom is, you need to put a recorder on your telephone. So that way, every phone call you make, if it's to Jordan, if it's to the police, if it's to the State Department, you need recordings, because your mind is going to be all over the place, and you need to be able to remember what's happening, and things are going to happen fast. So she did. And when I started writing this book, I found all of those cassette tapes, and all these years later, they still work. Now, I had to go on Amazon and I had to order a cassette tape player, because who has one of those? Nobody,
Right.
but now I do, and it's pink.
Of course it is.
I mean, it's just amazing when I listen to these tapes. I'm like, I feel like I'm watching the movie all over again. So it was days of making phone calls to the State Department, and the State Department said, there's nothing we can do. We hear these stories all the time. There are no treaties between the United States and Jordan. There are tons of children that have been taken, and there's nothing that we can do. And then, of course, calling the police, and the police were like, ma'am, this is out of our jurisdiction. There's nothing we can do. Well, if you know my mom, that is not the right answer. She's
No,
going to push and push, right? I mean, she's just going to, and thank God for that. And so Rick was just calling every contact that he had. I mean, they were trying to figure out how to put together a mission on their own to go to Jordan and to get me back themselves. Because everyone they talked to, someone in the State Department put my mom in contact with a group of people that had also had their children abducted. And talking to those parents and grandparents, every story, they were telling my mom they hadn't seen their children in 2 and 3 years. grandparents going over to Israel like twice a year to see their loved ones. And my mom was like, that's just not good enough for me. So she was very distraught at this point. She was smoking probably 3 or 4 packs of cigarettes a day. She was beside herself, of all the emotions, and everywhere you turn, people giving her advice. And she got to the point where Beverly had called her. Now, Bev and Rick and their daughter Miranda had moved into the townhouse at this point to help my mom. They wanted to be with her, day and night with everything that was going on. And my Aunt Joyce was there as well. But there was a moment that Beverly called my mom. And she said, Kathy, you need to get away. You need to get away from all the noise, and you need to get on your knees and you need to pray. And my mom just starts crying, and she's like, you're right. I just need to get away. I don't know what to do. And then Beverly's brother, Stan, was in the background, and you can hear him on these voice recordings, and he's telling my mom scripture verses and talking about Daniel in the lion's den, and just preaching to my mom that, God is mighty and he is good and he is mighty to save, and there's nothing impossible with God. And my mom's just crying, and Beverly's praying. And then my mom begins to say, well, what about Lauren's safety? And I don't want Lauren to be in the mosque and to be around all that false religion. And so Beverly said, we're just going to pray over that right now. And she just began to pray over me, that just a hedge of protection over me, and that I would know Jesus through all of it and my safety. And at the end of all of Beverly praying, she said, Kathy, not that long ago, I was in a bad place, and I had locked myself in my bathroom, and I was on my knees on that bathroom floor, and that's where I found God. And I read a book, and it said, fasting is the thing that brings you closest to Jesus. And Beverly told my mom, I think you need to be alone. You need to go fast and pray. And my mom broke down, and she said, yes, I need to give up these cigarettes. I need to fast and pray. I need to focus on God and get away from all the distractions. So before my mom could go and into her prayer closet, Rick had set up a court, a jury with the Dallas grand jury, and he had pulled some connections to be able to get her in front of the jury. And so he had told her, Kathy, there's probably nothing that's going to come out of this except for maybe a warrant for Ollie's arrest if Ollie comes back to Jordan, to the United States, because there's nothing else that they can do. And so she wasn't very. So on the way to the grand jury meeting, Rick had told my mom, probably not a lot's going to come out of this meeting, except for the purpose was to get a warrant out for my dad's arrest if he ever came back into the United States. So my mom was not very hopeful going into that meeting, but it was just another process. So when she walked in, she was nervous and full of emotions, and she stood in that courtroom with a panel of jurors, and she began to tell them that she had full custody of me, and that I was a United States citizen, born and raised in Richardson, Texas, and that my father had taken me to Jerash, Jordan. And she had begun to tell them everything that she had done to try to get me back, but at that point, nothing had opened, no open doors for her. Mm-hmm. So all of the jury were nodding their heads, and someone said, ma'am, I'm so sorry. We hear this story all of the time, but there's nothing that we can do for you. It's out of our jurisdiction. We can give you support and send you to the different groups that are out there. And at that moment, my mom just had a lump in her throat, and she just began to cry. And she was like, can I be honest with you? This isn't fair. We pay all of this money, in taxes, and we pay all of this money to foreign aid, and you're telling me that the United States cannot do anything to help me get my daughter back? This is just not fair. Mm-hmm. And every person sitting on that jury shook their head, and they said, you are exactly right. It's not fair. And one man stood up. His name's Al Zapanta. He opened his wallet, and he gave my mom his business card. And he said, I actually work for the State Department. And if you are not satisfied with the State Department, here's my card. Give me a call, and I'll see what I can do for you. Wow. So my mom walked out of that courtroom that day and still just sort of feeling defeated, and got in the car, and Rick drove her back, and she told Rick about Al. But when she got back to the townhouse, she just grabbed her bag, she grabbed her Bible, and she got in the car and she started driving to Fort Worth, having no clue where she was going. And she checked herself in some little dumpy motel, and she stayed there for 3 days and 3 nights, and she fasted and prayed. And God sent her to the story of Daniel. And pretty much God was saying, I hear you, Daniel. I've heard every prayer you ever prayed, and I have not left you. And my mom heard God sort of tell her in her spirit, Kathy, lay down your cigarettes and let me be your comfort instead of your cigarettes or your addiction, right? And you need to forgive. You need to forgive the people that have done you wrong, and let me begin to heal you. And so my mom said, I'm done. I lay my cigarettes at your feet. I forgive. I let go of the anger. And she walked out of that little motel room with peace for the first time in weeks. She drove back to the condo, and Beverly was like, Kathy, you look so different. You just look like a different woman. And my mom said, I'm going to see Lauren again. I know God is going to see us through this. And she actually went and like got her oil changed and paid some bills. Like she did like normal stuff for the first time in weeks. And then she remembered that business card. So she pulled out that card.
At this point, how long had you been kidnapped?
I had probably been gone about 3 weeks by this point.
Oh, okay.
And my mom was calling daily to Jordan, daily. And every time she would call, it would be the different family members. My dad had a huge family, and they would only speak Arabic. And my mom was desperate, saying, this is Kathy. This is Lauren's mother. Please let me talk to her. This isn't fair. He's taken me. Someone tell me, is he there? And they just spoke Arabic the whole time. And she would break down crying. Can I please talk to Ali? Can I please talk to someone that speaks English? Anybody? And it was just day after day after day of that. Now, she was able to talk to my stepmother. My stepmother was in New Jersey at the time, and she was clueless on what my dad had done. And she was trying to help my mom find out where my dad was, and she was trying to talk my dad into bringing me back. And he wasn't having anything to do with her either, pretty much.
Wow.
Yeah. So I can back up a minute. He had sent my stepmother was pregnant at the time. And so he sent my stepmom and the other 2 children to New Jersey, saying, you need a vacation and a little break since you're pregnant, because he didn't want her around when he took me.
Of course not.
Mm-hmm. So it was all premeditated and planned.
In the movie, okay, and I was mesmerized by that movie. Just going to say it. In the movie, it came out that in Jordan, a parent is able to have full custody of the child at age 7, and your mother was very certain that your father strategically timed it to fit that guideline, that law.
Absolutely. So my birthday's in September, and he took me in October. So the whole thing, at the age of 7, all rights go to the father. So that's exactly right. He had planned the whole thing. He'd been wanting to go back to Jordan and trying to talk my stepmother into going back to Jordan, but she didn't want to go either. And she was even saying, what are you going to do about Lauren? You're just going to leave Lauren? And he said, well, I'll come and visit Lauren. I'm not worried. We'll come on frequent trips. So he had been planning all of this the whole time. Right. And then while she was in New Jersey, she kept telling him, you're never going to see your unborn child. You're never going to see your other children if you don't bring Lauren back, because I'm not going to go to Jordan and be a mother to Lauren knowing that what you've done. So it was a lot of turmoil throughout the whole family. But he was hard. He didn't care. He wasn't going to bring me back.
So did she stay in New Jersey that whole time, or did she ever relent and go to Jordan?
No, she stayed in New Jersey the whole time. And that's what was so confusing with me. When my dad had picked me up that day, and I, had my suitcase ready with my little Halloween costume, and I get in the car and he's like, I have a surprise for you. We're going on an airplane. We're going to Jordan. I'm like, what? Mom said we were going trick-or-treating with my sister and my brother. And he's like, well, you're going to get to meet all your family in Jordan, and they're going to come later. But when I was in Jordan, they never came. And the days turn into weeks and the weeks turn into months. And then my dad put me in school. And when I started going to school, I knew this is not a vacation anymore, because
Mm-hmm.
he said, you can learn how to speak Arabic. And that's when I knew I don't know if I'm ever going to see my mom again.
I cannot imagine. You had to have been scared to death at that point.
I was. I mean, that was total culture shock for me. I the biggest difference was in Dallas. My dad was loving and kind and very involved. Tuck me into bed at night, read me stories, play with me, cook dinner with me. There, it was clear lines that the man's job was to, be out and working, and the women's job was to be home and take care of the kids. And so I didn't know my grandmother, and I didn't know all my aunts, and they all spoke Arabic, and he pretty much left me with them, and they were loving and kind, but I mean, it was a culture shock for me. He was never around. They were always the ones taking care of me. It was very different. And we would eat on the floor with our hands. There were no utensils. The bathroom was a hole in the floor. There was no toilet.
Wow.
Um, for a 7-year-old little girl, that was devastating. I had one uncle that had polio, and so he had to have a toilet, and he lived on the third floor. So I would walk to the third floor to use that bathroom because I refused to use the hole in the ground. Um, yeah, so it was a lot. And then going to the mosque, I thought I was praying to Jesus in a different language. I didn't know. But like I had to cover my hair, and the men and the women couldn't pray together, and we prayed on a prayer rug. So it was just a lot of confusion and different things. I was well taken care of. Um, but I knew not to ask about my mom, because anytime I asked about my mom, my dad would get very upset. And if I asked about my stepmother, my dad would get very upset. And he was like, "It's fine, Lauren, it's fine. You'll see them soon." And when I finally got to talk to my mom on the phone, he gave me lots of rules. He said, "Don't say anything bad about me or my family. If she asks questions, don't tell her where you are. And I'm going to be listening right beside you on the phone conversation." So I knew enough to know to be guarded in what I said on the phone. And of course, he told my mom the same thing as well. So it was a very awkward phone conversation. Um, so I was there for 3 months, began going to school, learning how to speak Arabic. And in that 3-month time frame, I was speaking Arabic fluently. Now, I don't know any Arabic anymore. Um, but while all of that was going on, my mom was trying to get connected with military expertise that could go to Jordan to get me out. She was also trying to get passports and paperwork for me because, of course, she didn't have a passport for me. My dad had my passport.
Mm-hmm.
So Al flew my mom to Washington, and she was there for, I want to say, a week and a half. She thought she'd be there a few days, but it was almost turning into 2 weeks, trying to go to the Jordan embassy, getting me passports, trying to get visas for me. But Al was able to connect her with all the right people to get the correct paperwork. And of course, it cost a lot of money to get that paperwork as well. And then, go ahead.
That right there is just such a provision of God that he just happened to be in that jury room. And that was no coincidence. That was a divine appointment that God orchestrated.
And then I found out, listening to these tapes, the week before Al was in that courtroom. And again, why was he there? Um, the week before he was in that courtroom, he met with a man named Everett Alvarez. He is a very well-known military, I think one of the first POWs. And he was in Washington meeting with Mr. Alvarez because they're friends. And Mr. Alvarez was telling Al about CTU. CTU is the company of the military expertise, the men, Dave Chatelier and Don Feeney. Those were the men that went over to get me back. But the week before he went to the jury, the courtroom, he had just met with Mr. Alvarez, and Mr. Alvarez was telling him about these men, these expertise that their goal is to go into the Middle East and help rescue not just children, but different people that have been captured for different reasons. So God's just his
Wow.
timing and his hand and all the connections. So
Mhm.
after my mom called Al put her in contact with the CTU men, and they flew to Dallas. My mom flew them to Dallas to meet with her. And my mom was detailed. She had binders of every detail about every one of my dad's family members, from where they live, who they're married to, what their career is, even descriptions of my dad's house. She drew sketches. She had gone and gotten maps of where they lived. She was so organized, and they were so impressed. And my mom said, if y'all aren't going to help me, this is going to happen one way or the other. And so they were like, we are 100% in. We want to get your daughter back. And JD was another man that they recruited to come on board. And JD was a Christian. And before every mission, they would pray every time.
So, did you all stay in contact with them after the whole ordeal was over?
I've stayed in contact with JD. It's been a couple years, but I actually got to meet. I always called him my hero. I got to meet his kids and his wife, and years ago did like a family vacation in Florida together. And I've recently spoken with Al. Al is like, I think 82, and so we're going to meet up soon, I hope.
That's great.
But so what they did. The plan was the men went over to Jordan to find me. My mom had given them pictures, given them all the details. But once they got there, they were like, these pictures are old and outdated. Nothing looked the same. Like the old dirt roads that my mom had seen were now paved. The small little buildings were now like 4 stories high. So they spent days searching the streets of Jerash. And Jerash is a small town. So one, they were afraid if they spent too much time, they were going to be recognized in that town. And they didn't want to waste too much time looking for me. So after days and days and days of searching through the streets and the ruins and all over the place, they called my mom and they said, Kathy, you're going to have to come and help us, because nothing that you've described in your photos is the same. We can't find Lauren. And so she flew into Cyprus, and then they drove her into Jordan and disguised her. And the same thing, when she was sitting in the front seat of that car as one of the men were driving her through the streets, her heart was pounding, her mind was racing. Nothing looked the same. Wow. And she just began to pray. And she got down in the floorboard on her hands and knees with her face down in the seat of the car. And she began to cry and pray out loud hysterically with these 3 men in the car. And she just said, God, you're going to have to find her. I can't do this without you. Show me where she is. So with my mom's eyes closed, it's like, she said, it's like God just started beginning to remind her of when she had walked the streets so many years before. And she began to say, turn left, go straight, turn right. And as the car started going up a hill, she remembered walking up a hill towards where my dad's family's home. Wow. And about that time, she looked out and she saw my dad standing out on the street, and she froze. And a couple of blocks down the road, she finally said, I saw Ollie. I saw him back on the street. So the men told her to cover her face and to turn away, and they did a loop back around. And sure enough, they had seen my dad's car sitting out on the street with the Texas license on it, because he had brought a car over from the United States. So that's how they found the location of where my dad was. And that was the first time that they had found it. So after that, they started scouting the house, because they were trying to figure out, how are they going to get me? It wasn't very safe to try to bust in the house in the middle of the city to get me. And so they started scouting the house to see, was I going to school? Was I on a school bus? What's the best way to see me? And at that point, they hadn't set eyes on me yet, right? So they all had photos of me, and I have dark complexion, olive complexion, and dark hair. But the thing that stands out is my eyes. I have my mom's bluish green eyes. So one day, one of the men was sitting on the street corner with my picture, and he was watching the school buses go by. And he said, as that bus went by, it stopped right in front of him, and he locked eyes with me. And that's when he knew. And then every day after that, they would watch that bus, and I always sat in the same seat. We had assigned seats. And so they started following that bus. Well, we had recently, I told my mom this after I got back, there was a new kid that just started going to school, and they lived in a little farmhouse right on the outskirts of town. It wasn't in the middle of the city. So when they followed the bus and they saw that little farmhouse, they decided that's where they were going to get me. They were going to hijack that bus and get me off. That would be the safest route. So that's exactly what they did. They had a getaway car. They had the main car that came up behind the bus as we stopped to let the child on. They pulled in behind the bus to block us. And then one of the guys got out, I believe it was JD, got out and got the keys out of the ignition of the bus. And he threw the keys into some bushes, hoping that that would be a distraction and they would go looking for the keys. And then another gentleman went over and was trying to pry open the doors of the bus. And then during that time, my mom walked over to my window and she knocked on my window and she stared eye to eye at me. And I froze. I remember looking at my mom thinking, that looks like my mom, but how can it be? She's all the way in Texas. That can't be her. And so my mom's trying to motion to me to get off the bus. And I just sat and froze and I didn't move. So she had to, as one of the commandos was trying to push his way on, she squeezed through those doors and pushed her way on past the lady chaperone. And she grabbed me. And of course, like every mother, she's like, well, okay, let's get your little book bag and your backpack. And so she's gathering up my things. Like I really needed that stuff. And she's pushing her way off the bus. And as we're getting off the bus, the lady chaperone jumps on my mom's back. And with all the commotion and all these, big military guys, she turns around and she has to punch the lady in her nose and blood's coming out of her nose. And then I'm really in shock because I'm like, okay, now my mom's punching someone and now there's blood. So all of that commotion. And so as that's happening, another car starts to come down this country road with its car full of people. So one of the men comes over and grabs my mom and puts his arm around my mom's shoulder and turns her away and sort of like waves at the car, so hoping that they would just think it's some like domestic, conflict, and they just kept on driving. And thank God they did. They just kept driving. So then they got me in the floorboard of the car and they covered me up. And as they were trying to look for the keys, we all got in the car and drove off. And then a couple blocks down the road, we pulled over and we switched cars with our getaway car. That way they wouldn't recognize the car and the license plate that we were in. And during this time, they had already made fake airplane flights for us, reservations from the Olive Airport back to Texas, hoping that on the day of the rescue that they would look for us at the airport, because the plan was for us to drive into Israel into the Alamy Bridge. I'm probably not pronouncing that one correctly. And that's exactly what happened. And on that day, the code word, so if everything was going well and things were a go, Al Zaponta, he came up with the code word, and the code word is the sun is shining. Well, to my mom, the sun is Jesus. So even the code word was, yes, the sun is shining. So that drive from Jerash, from the bus to Israel, it was so foggy and so dark. Driving down those roads, the only thing you could see in the distance, my mom said, what is that? The only thing you could see the sun starting to rise and clear from all the fog. And one of the men said, that's Israel. And that's where the sun is shining. And again, it's just like, God's like, I've got you. I am going to rescue you. I am going to restore and redeem you. So as we're driving in that checkpoint, you can't drive your own car over that border. You have to leave your car. So we had to get out of the car and we had to wait at the bus stop. And that waiting seemed like days of waiting. And so So we're waiting, and my mom's trying to stay calm and like keep everything together. And my mom's like, Lauren's burning up with a fever. She's only speaking Arabic. What's going on? And the men are like, it's normal. She's in shock. Don't worry, Kathy. And they're trying to keep it cool with all these, military soldiers all around them. And so they're checking our paperwork. We're able to get onto the bus, but then we have to sit on the bus forever. And we're waiting for the soldier to get on the bus so that we can drive across it into Israel. Because once we were in the midpoint of that bridge, as soon as we crossed over, we knew we were safe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're finally load up and we're driving through that over that bridge, or starting to go over the bridge. And all of a sudden there's a commotion of people, of soldiers coming up. And right as we get over into Israel, we pass the flag, that's when they realized I was not at the airport. At this point, they had shut down that whole entire airport looking for us. That's when they knew that I was on the bus. But at that point, there's nothing they could do because we had already passed into Israel. So we get off the bus and my mom breaks down crying. She's kissing all over me. She's like hysterical. And there was this group of women, tourists, and they were there on like a Holy Land tour. So one of them goes over and is like, excuse me, sir, what's going on? Is that lady okay? Like, are they all right? So they begin to tell the women what had just happened. And they're like, praise you, Jesus. We've come to the Holy Land and we have seen a miracle. So it was just amazing, just every step of the way of how God was there.
So now you're writing a book about this. You want to talk about that for a minute?
I am. About, I guess, 9 months ago or a year ago, I just really felt led. I was reading Miranda Lambert recently. She wrote a cookbook, and I was reading her cookbook of all the recipes of her mom Beverly, and I've eaten Beverly's meatloaf for years, and her dad Rick's famous barbecue sauce, and reading about her grandmother, her nanny. And as I'm reading all these stories, I just really felt led, like God was telling me, Lauren, you need to write your story. And I thought, I can't write my story. I have dyslexia. I'm horrible at spelling. I'm a full-time physical therapist. I'm a mom. I'm at soccer every weekend. Like, how am I supposed to write a book? But I just started praying about it. I'm like, okay, God, I'm going to pray. Next day, I kept feeling that nudging. Lauren, write your story. And I'm like, all right, God, I will write it. I will put it on paper. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to pray. And if you'll open the door for me, if you'll bring me the resources, the editor, the publishers, the whatever I need, I will be obedient, but I need you to show me how to do this. So I'm in the midst of writing a book. I'm in the midst of trying to put together a website and trying to put together a podcast as well. So that's what I'm working on. And I know God's just going to continue to open those doors for me.
Without a doubt, he will. Your story has just been such a blessing and so encouraging. And just to see how God worked through the midst of that trauma and brought you through it, and seeing, the happy ending, and also, just, knowing your mom and all that she went through, and to see her and finally get to meet you, that's been a great blessing.
Thank you. And my heart for my book really is about forgiveness. It's an amazing story of what God did, but there was a lot of hurt. I had to change my last name. We lived in hiding for a long time. A lot of anger that I had towards God of, why did this have to happen to me? Why did I have to have such a crazy childhood? Why didn't I get to know my dad? And why did my family look so messed up and broken? I went through a lot of brokenness in my life. Even though it's an amazing story, there's a lot of hurt that came with it. And so my passion is to show I forgave my dad a long time ago because God's walked me through that healing. So that's really my passion, is to minister to people in that way as well.
So people who have brokenness in their lives and need to walk through the forgiveness process, that's what you're seeking to help with.
Absolutely. I mean, brokenness of a failed marriage, or living in a divorced family or not ever knowing your parents, maybe a story out of adoption or loss. I mean, there's so many people that can relate. You don't have to be kidnapped to relate to that deep, deep hurt and anger and resentment. Because when you don't forgive, your heart becomes hard, and then you are full of anger and resentment, and you just don't realize that you either can be, you seclude and you hide, or maybe you lash out in anger if you don't deal with all of that. And it took me a long time to realize, because I thought, how can I forgive my dad for what he did? Because what he did wasn't okay. It took me a long time to realize forgiving doesn't mean that it's okay, and forgiving doesn't mean that I have to forget. Forgiving means I'm giving it to Jesus. I'm laying it at the cross and letting him handle all the things. And then I'm just going to trust that God's going to walk me through it.
That is everything right there. That is everything. So you are amazing, and I know that God has big plans for your future because you are trusting him, and he's going to have his way, and you're letting him, and that's what will guide your success. So thank you so much for coming on with us. It's been such a blessing to hear your story, and yes, I watched the movie. It was great.
Well, thank you very much. The movie is Desperate Rescue, the Kathy Mahone story. It was on NBC, but you can find it on YouTube. And if you want to find me, I'm L Burns PT on Instagram. And then hopefully soon I'll have my webpage up, laurenburns.net. And I can't thank you enough, Mary, for allowing me to be on and share my story. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, the privilege and the honor and the blessing is all ours. And we thank you for being on our podcast today.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
And,
thank you.
Bye-bye. And maybe we'll do a part 2 after your book is published. How about that?
That sounds awesome. I like that.
Right. We would love that. Okay. Well, thanks very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.